Hey everyone, Elliot here. Thought we'd try something new today. I try to record a short video today summarizing my most recent Substack on private equity and other investors backed childcare chains fighting back against attempts to put in place policy guardrails. It's a complicated issue. Lots of reasonable people can reasonably disagree about it. I thought some of the arguments I've been hearing coming from the backers of these chains really worth deconstructing, though. And so, in my piece, I talk about four main arguments that we've been hearing. And when I say we've been hearing, really been tracking, particularly in Colorado, where I live, efforts to defeat a bill that would put into place pretty modest guardrails. At this point, the bill has been watered down. So, really, all that's on the table is that these chain programs would have to provide a 60-day notice to staff or families if they were going to make major changes after acquiring a new program, and that they would have to, if requested by the Colorado Department of Early Childhood, to provide financial statements that showed their general financial health. So, again, nothing particularly onerous here, but we really heard four main arguments against these guardrails. The first is that different businesses shouldn't be regulated just based on their ownership structure. It sounds okay on its face as like a fairness argument, but the fact is that we differently regulate different types of programs all the time. We do that by size. If you're a small business or a large business, we do that by whether you're a nonprofit or if you're a for profit that's privately held. If you're a franchisor, you have to do different things in terms of your legal requirements. And if you're publicly traded on the stock market and regulated by the Security and Exchanges Commission, then you have to do different regulatory items in order to stay in compliance. So, this idea that just because of an ownership structure, we shouldn't regulate private equity and venture capital backed childcare chains differently, it really doesn't hold up. An example I give, it's not in government, but I think it's very telling. The NFL, they started allowing private equity to buy stakes in teams, put in place some guardrails. You have to hold, your ownership stake for a certain number of years. You can only take a certain maximum percentage of ownership, which other types of owners don't have to abide by, which I think tells you something. If the NFL is willing to differently regulate private equity, then maybe we should be paying attention to that in a place like childcare or other human services. The second argument that I hear is really this idea that it's only 10% of the sector. Only 10% of the sector is investor backed in childcare. And so, why are we focusing so much on 10%? Well, not all 10% of the sector is made equal. This is 10% held by a very small number of companies. I give the example KinderCare, the largest of these chains, which is now publicly traded on the stock market, although it used to be owned by private equity, and its private equity owner, which is Swiss based, still has a controlling share of KinderCare. They own 70% of it. But my point is, KinderCare has over 200,000 children that it serves. It has more centers and more capacity than most small U.S. states and some medium-sized U.S. states. And so, this idea that understanding its financial health, understanding how a KinderCare or a Primrose or a learning experience, or the Learning Care Group, which is La Petite Academy, ones like that, understanding the financial health of these chains, understanding how they're choosing to operate, making sure that they're not making bad decisions just because of seeking profit, it seems really reasonable given their size. So, yes, in aggregate, it's only 10%, but it's a very important 10%. And it's also 10% there's a lot of political power. So, this is not just a random amalgamation of really small mom and pop centers. These are a small cohort of very large, very profit motivated companies. Third argument that we hear is that a lot of chain programs are high quality. And why would we worry about regulating them if they're doing a good job? And what I say is, it's a feint. It's immaterial. It does not matter for the discussion at hand about policy guardrails. I don't think it's worth getting into a big debate over quality. You can kind of cut it multiple ways. You can look at any given chain, and there's a lot of variation in what quality measures do exist just within those chain sites. You can find some that are really highly rated, some that are not rated very well, some that are literally on the verge of losing their license because they have so many violations, some which have never had a licensing violation. Lots of variation, just like there's variation in other types of childcare. Fine. That's not the point. There's a pedagogical teaching education side of these chains, and there's a business operation side of these chains. And we have unimpeachable data from the companies themselves showing how they operate sometimes around their business operations. So when KinderCare did their IPO, they had to release a bunch of documents talking about their business. And one of the things that they said was that between 2012 and 2017, they actually closed 380 centers across the country because they were underperforming, quote unquote. These are strategic closures, not because those centers weren't, didn't have anyone to serve, not for any reason other than they weren't making enough money, and they wanted to push enrollment up in adjacent centers that would be therefore making more money. So that's a business operations decision. That has nothing to do with the quality of those sites. When Guidepost Montessori just this year is because it was pseudo collapsing, having to close a third of its sites nationwide because it expanded much too quickly. But one of its investors called it a hyperscaling strategy, and it got to the point where it can't pay rent to its landlords. The quality of the sites that are being closed and that landlords are changing the locks on doesn't matter. What matters is that business operations decisions were made in search of growth and profit that ended up crashing the chain. So again, the quality is sort of immaterial here. It seems more like a distraction. It's a shiny object. And the last argument that you hear is this really around this idea of supply. And this is the one I say, unfortunately, it's the one that lands, I think, the best, because there's some truth to it, which is that right now, because of how neglected our childcare system is and how few other options there are from public entities to actually purchase closing childcare programs or programs that where the owner wants to sell, frequently the only recourse that those independent programs have are selling to a private equity or other investor backed chain. It is very hard to get startup capital for a childcare program, but that's a public policy problem. That's not a reason to not regulate or not have oversight or reasonable non-onerous guardrails over these types of chains. That's a reason to think about alternate ownership transition structures. It's not a defense, just because that's the way that things are right now. And I think the really gets really to some negative and I would argue problematic arguments around why private equity chains shouldn't be touched. Uh, and there was a cite the testimony of the CEO of the Gardner School chain, and this is a private equity owned chain. And the CEO testified before the House committee. I'll just quote him here. There's a precedent that can be set here where organizations like mine, which make decisions about opportunity costs all the time, should we invest in Colorado, should it be in Michigan or one of our other states? If standards set by this bill cause either the expense or risk to increase above and beyond where it is elsewhere for us, then I fear that our growth will slow, if not stop, in Colorado. And then the real issue, which is providing access, and he talks about why that's important, will go in the wrong direction. And, that's a lot of nice words. It's basically a threat. If you try to regulate us, we're going to take our ball and go home. It reminds me of sort of the old protection racket. Sure would be a bad thing. Sure would be rough if your state's childcare shortage got worse, wouldn't it? But that's where we've gotten to. And it's also, by the way, as an asterisk, one reason why ultimately we need national guardrails so that they can't just play states off of each other. But that's obviously not going to happen anytime soon. But my point is, all of these are distractions. None of these are actual justifications for why chain childcare programs that are backed by institutional investors shouldn't have common sense guardrails against profit maximizing behavior, against making bad decisions, against their collapse because of what that will mean. So I argue here that essentially, if their arguments are don't regulate us because you should just by our ownership structure, that doesn't hold water. Don't regulate us because we're only 10% of the sector, that doesn't hold water. Don't regulate us because of our quality, that doesn't hold water. And don't regulate us because of you need us, which has some truth, but again, is not a justification for not actually getting guardrails put up around you if you're that type of a program. All of those are necessarily feints because there really isn't a good justification for letting private equity and other investors operate unfettered with no oversight in childcare. And I'll just close by saying this: like, it is frightening when you look at what private equity in particular has done in other human services, what they have done in nursing homes, in autism services, and prison services. I regularly recommend the book Plunder by Brendan Blue, and I'll recommend it again. My point is, there is not an example of private equity operating in a human service where it has ended well for the humans being served. And so, why we would think that childcare is the one magical human service where having this kind of investor activity is going to end up with better things happening for children and parents and early educators is beyond me. These financial institutions exist to make money. There's nothing wrong with the idea of trying to make money generally. However, when that comes with risk and that comes with cost to children, to parents, to educators, and to the system writ large, which the society, community, and the economy relies on, then it is incumbent, it is necessary for the government in the public interest to step in and provide oversight and provide guardrails. So I'm really hopeful that these arguments, kind of deflect off and do not get deep seated in policymakers' minds because they don't hold water. These chains do need regulation. They do need extra oversight. And there are plenty of regulations that should, can, and will continue to apply across the board. But there is a set of guardrails that these type of investor-backed programs deserve to have put around them. And I hope that lawmakers everywhere are paying very, very close attention. So thanks, y'all, and we'll talk again soon.